Good evening, generals, and welcome to... You probably assume I will say men around the Führer series, but hear me out first. History has a way of forgetting. In the grand narratives of wars and revolutions, of empires rising and falling, countless names slip through the cracks. The spies who operated in the shadows, the resistance fighters who sabotaged tyranny at the cost of their own lives, the soldiers whose extraordinary deeds were overshadowed by larger battles, the men and women whose courage changed the course of history, yet whose stories were never properly told. This is the mission of our new series, Unsung Heroes. We are here to shine a light on those forgotten warriors, those invisible heroes whose sacrifices deserve to be remembered. We are here to pull their stories from the dusty corners of history and give them the recognition they have always deserved. Because every hero, no matter how forgotten, deserves to live forever in the memory of those who came after. Now, that doesn't mean the end of Men Around the Führer series. I am just adding a new one to go along with it. Tonight, we begin with a story that crosses centuries and cultures, a story of ancient warrior traditions meeting modern warfare, a story that almost no one knows. This is the story of the last war chief. In the spring of 1945, somewhere in the German countryside near the Danube River, an American Army scout crept through the pre-dawn darkness toward a stone farmhouse. The war in Europe was nearly over, but this soldier had one final mission to complete, though it had nothing to do with his official orders. Beneath his olive-drab uniform, two red war stripes painted on his arms. Hidden inside his helmet, a sacred yellow eagle feather. And in his mind, the words of his grandfather echoing across the years, telling him what he must do to become a war chief. What this soldier was about to do would bridge two worlds separated by centuries, connecting the ancient warrior traditions of the Great Plains with the mechanized warfare of the 20th century. This is the story of Joseph Medicine Crow, a man who became the last war chief of the Crow Nation and the last Plains Indian war chief in history by fighting Nazis in World War II. But to understand this remarkable story, we must first journey back to the windswept plains of Montana, to a time when the Crow people still remembered the old ways, and to a boy who would be taught to become a warrior in a world that no longer made war the way his ancestors had. Joseph Medicine Crow was born on October 27, 1913, in a log house on the Crow Indian Reservation near Lodge Grass, Montana. His Crow name was Highbird, though for many years he was known by another name given to him by an old Sioux warrior, Winter Man. He was born into the Whistling Water clan, and from the moment he drew his first breath, he was surrounded by living history. His family was not just any family. His step-grandfather was White Man Runs Him, one of the Crow Scouts who had ridden with General George Armstrong Custer and who had witnessed the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876 from a nearby ridge. White Man Runs Him was one of the last living connections to that fateful day, and the young Joseph would sit at his feet, listening to first-hand accounts of that battle that had become legend. His paternal grandfather was Chief Medicine Crow, a warrior of such renown that his name still carried weight across the northern plains. Chief Medicine Crow had become a war chief at the age of 22, setting a standard that seemed almost impossible to match. He was known as Sacred Raven to his people, and his exploits as a horse thief and warrior were the stuff of tribal legend. But it was his maternal grandfather, a man named Yellowtail, who would shape Joseph Medicine Crow into a warrior. And he began this training when the boy was only 6 or 7 years old. The training was not gentle. It was not gradual. It was designed to forge a warrior who could survive anything the Great Plains could throw at him. On winter mornings, when the Montana cold cut like a knife, Yellowtail would wake the boy before dawn. They would walk to the river, where Yellowtail would chop a hole in the ice, and then they would plunge into that freezing water. After the shocking bath, Yellowtail would tell the boy to run through the snow, barefoot, for 100 yards or more, the boy's feet pounding through the drifts, learning to ignore the pain, learning to master his body's protests, learning that the mind could overcome what the body feared. In summer and fall, the training took different forms. Joseph learned to ride horses bareback, to become one with the animal beneath him. He learned to track game through the wilderness, to read signs in the grass and the dirt that would tell him where an animal had passed, how long ago, and where it was heading. He learned to sleep on the ground, wrapped only in a blanket, to move silently through the forest, to become a shadow that could pass without being seen or heard. But the physical training was only part of his education. Yellowtail and the other elders taught him the stories of great warriors, the stories of coups counted and enemies touched and horses stolen, the stories of honor and leadership and courage, and they taught him about the 4 war deeds. In Crow tradition, any man could be a warrior, but to become a war chief, to earn that highest honor, a man had to accomplish 4 specific deeds in battle. These were not easy tasks. These were deeds that required a warrior to risk everything, to put himself in the greatest danger, to prove beyond any doubt that he possessed not just courage, but intelligence, skill, and leadership. The 4 war deeds were these. First, a warrior must touch a living enemy without killing him. This was called counting coup, and it was considered the highest honor because it proved a warrior could get close enough to an enemy to touch him and escape unharmed. It showed control, bravery, and skill. Second, a warrior must take an enemy's weapon, not kill him and take it afterwards, but wrestle it away from him in combat. Third, a warrior must lead a successful war party. He must bring men into battle and bring them home again, victorious. And fourth, perhaps most difficult of all in an age of mechanized warfare, a warrior must steal an enemy's horse. As young Joseph Medicine Crow listened to these requirements, they must have seemed almost impossible. The old days were gone. The Crow no longer went to war against the Cheyenne or the Lakota. The buffalo were gone. The open plains were fenced. The age of the warrior seemed to have passed into history. But Yellowtail taught the boy anyway, as if the old ways still mattered, as if the day might still come when these skills would be needed. Warfare was our highest art, Medicine Crow would later write, but Plains Indian warfare was not about killing. It was about intelligence, leadership, and honor. Yet Joseph Medicine Crow's life was not to be confined to the reservation. His family understood that the world had changed, and that education was now the key to survival and success. Chief Plenty Coups, one of the great Crow leaders, had said it plainly. Education is your greatest weapon. With education, you are the white man's equal. Without education, you are his victim, and so shall remain all of your lives. At the age of 11, something extraordinary happened. Joseph was present when historians came to interview his step-grandfather, White Man Runs Him, about the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The boy listened as the old scout described what he had seen that day in 1876. He was hearing history directly from someone who had been there, and it made an impression that would last his entire life. When he was old enough, Joseph left the reservation to attend school. He went to Bacone College in Muskogee, Oklahoma, a school established for Native Americans. He studied there until 1936, earning an Associate of Arts degree. Then he continued his education at Linfield College in McMinnville, Oregon, where he studied sociology and psychology, graduating in 1938, but he was not finished. In 1939, Joseph Medicine Crow achieved something no member of the Crow tribe had ever done before. He earned a master's degree in anthropology from the University of Southern California. His thesis was titled, "The Effects of European Culture Contact upon the Economic, Social, and Religious Life of the Crow Indians," and it would become a respected work in the field. He was the first Crow to earn a master's degree, and he was not satisfied. He began work toward a doctorate at USC, and by 1941, he had completed all the required coursework. He was deep into writing his dissertation when history intervened. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States was at war, and Joseph Medicine Crow, scholar and anthropologist, knew what he had to do. As he would later put it with characteristic humor, he could not complete his doctorate because his Uncle Sam had other plans for him. In 1942, Joseph Medicine Crow made his way to an induction center in Ogden, Utah. At the center, he encountered a college roommate who recognized him. The induction officer, learning of Medicine Crow's advanced education, immediately offered him a commission as an officer. This was a rare opportunity. especially for a Native American in the 1940s military. Medicine Crow refused. When asked why he would turn down such an offer, his answer was simple. He wanted to follow in his grandfather's footsteps. Chief Medicine Crow had been a scout, a horse thief, a warrior who had earned his honors in combat. Joseph Medicine Crow would not take a shortcut to glory. He would earn his honors the same way his grandfather had, so he enlisted as a private, and he requested assignment as a scout. Before he left for overseas, something happened that would change everything. His step-grandfather, White Man Runs Him, now an old man carrying the wisdom of a lifetime, called Joseph to him. The old scout looked at his great-nephew and spoke words that would echo through the coming years. White Man Runs Him told Joseph about the 4 war deeds. He explained what it meant to be a war chief, and then he said something that must have seemed almost absurd in the context of modern warfare. You must try to complete these deeds. You must become a war chief. How do you steal a horse from an enemy in a war fought with tanks and airplanes? How do you count coup when men kill each other from hundreds of yards away with rifles and machine guns? How do you prove yourself as a warrior when warfare itself has changed beyond recognition? Joseph Medicine Crow did not know the answers to these questions, but he was given 2 gifts to help him. A Sundance medicine man gave him a sacred eagle feather, painted yellow for protection, and he was given a supply of red ochre, the traditional war paint of the Crow people. Before every battle, Medicine Crow would mix the ochre with water and paint 2 red stripes on his arms, hidden beneath his uniform. The yellow eagle feather would be tucked inside his helmet, invisible to everyone but him. And in his heart, he carried the words of his grandfather and the traditions of his people. In late 1944, Private Joseph Medicine Crow shipped out to Europe with the 103rd Infantry Division. They were known as the Cactus Division, and they would see some of the heaviest fighting of the war's final year. The Liberty ship carrying Medicine Crow and the rest of the 103rd Infantry Division entered the Mediterranean Sea in October of 1944. Medicine Crow, working in the ship's kitchen, watched the coast of Africa slide past in the distance. It was his first time seeing another continent, another world so far from the plains of Montana. The ship docked in Marseille, France, on October 20th, part of Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France. As the men disembarked, they could hear German radio broadcasts. A propaganda announcer known as Axis Sally welcomed them by name. "Welcome to the 103rd Infantry Division," she said in perfect English. "We have a hot time waiting for you." She was not lying. That first night, Medicine Crow and his unit marched 25 miles through the darkness. They continued to march through France, pushing north toward Paris and Belgium, always pursuing the retreating German army. By November 9th, they were in heavy combat. By December 4th, they had taken the town of Sélestat, just 11 miles from the German border. And then they reached the Siegfried Line. The Siegfried Line was Germany's last great defensive barrier, a 400-mile series of fortifications protecting the homeland. It was a nightmare of concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, tank traps, trenches, minefields, and artillery positions. The Germans had designed it to be impenetrable. The French had built the famous Maginot Line to stop the Germans. The Siegfried Line was Germany's answer, and it was everything the Maginot Line had failed to be. The 103rd Infantry Division attacked the Siegfried Line on December 15, 1944. They were thrown back with heavy losses. The Germans, fighting now to defend their homeland, resisted with desperate ferocity. And then, on March 15, 1945, Private Joseph Medicine Crow received an order that would change his life. His commanding officer called him over. The situation was grim. An American unit carrying explosives had been wiped out by German fire while attempting to breach the Siegfried Line. The explosives were still there, somewhere in no man's land, but the men who had carried them were dead. The attack had stalled. Someone had to retrieve those explosives, cross a field of barbed wire and machine gun fire, reach the German positions, and blow a hole in the wall. Someone had to complete a mission that had already killed one entire squad. The commanding officer looked at Medicine Crow and said, "If anyone can do this, it's probably you." It was not exactly a vote of confidence. It was more like an acknowledgement that this was a suicide mission. and that Medicine Crow, with his scouting skills and his uncanny ability to survive, had the best chance of anyone to pull it off. Medicine Crow accepted the mission. He chose 7 men to go with him. Each man would carry explosives. Together, they would either blow a hole in the Siegfried line or die trying. Before they left, Medicine Crow painted the red stripes on his arms. He touched the yellow eagle feather in his helmet, and then he led his men out into hell. The field between the American and German lines was a killing ground. Barbed wire stretched in thick coils. German machine guns had the entire area pre-sighted. Artillery shells could drop at any moment, and somewhere out there in the smoke and death were the bodies of the men who had tried this before. Medicine Crow moved like a shadow. The skills Yellowtail had taught him, the ability to read the ground, to move silently, to become invisible, all of it came into play now. He led his men forward, choosing paths through the wire, timing their movements between machine gun bursts, using every depression in the ground for cover. They found the explosives, they retrieved them, and then, with bullets snapping past their heads and shells exploding around them, they reached the German wall. Medicine Crow and his men placed their charges. The countdown began. The explosion tore through the concrete, creating a gap in the supposedly impenetrable Siegfried line. And Medicine Crow led his 7 men back through the killing field. Not one man was lost. For this action, Private Medicine Crow was awarded the Bronze Star. But more importantly, he had completed the first of the 4 war deeds. He had led a successful war party. He had taken men into combat and brought them all home alive. He had led them to victory. 1 down, 3 to go. After the breach of the Siegfried line, the 103rd Infantry Division poured into Germany. The war was entering its final phase. The German army was collapsing, but it was far from finished. Pockets of fierce resistance remained, and the fighting was still deadly. In late April of 1945, the 103rd was ordered to capture the town of Münsingen. The Germans defended it with everything they had left. Street by street, building by building, the Americans had to fight for every inch of ground. Medicine Crow, as a scout, was often sent ahead of the main force. His job was to find enemy positions, to identify weak points in their defenses, to locate routes that would allow American troops to flank German positions. On one particular day, the main American force was attacking down a wide street, facing heavy German resistance. Medicine Crow's commanding officer ordered him to flank around through the back alleys and get behind the German positions. Medicine Crow moved quickly through the narrow streets. He turned a corner into an alley and ran straight into a German soldier who was trying to do exactly the same thing to the Americans. For a split second, the 2 men were face to face, both caught completely by surprise. Then their helmets crashed together as they collided. The impact knocked both men backwards. Medicine Crow recovered first. He swung his rifle like a club, striking the barrel of the German's weapon and sending it clattering to the ground. The German soldier, now disarmed, looked at Medicine Crow. Medicine Crow looked back at him. The German was young, probably no older than Medicine Crow himself, and he was unarmed. Medicine Crow could have shot him. It would have been easy. It would have been expected. This was war, after all. But Medicine Crow remembered the words of his grandfather. The 2nd war deed: take an enemy's weapon. The 3rd war deed: touch an enemy without killing him. Medicine Crow threw his own rifle aside. The German soldier's eyes widened, and then the 2 men began to fight hand to hand, grappling in the alley like warriors from an earlier age. They fell to the ground, rolling, punching, struggling for dominance. Medicine Crow got his hands around the German's throat and began to squeeze. The German soldier began crying out, calling for his mother. Medicine Crow, hearing that desperate cry, that universal sound of fear and pain, loosened his grip. He could not kill this man, not like this, not when he heard him crying for his mother. Medicine Crow subdued the German and took him prisoner. He had wrestled away an enemy's weapon. He had touched a living enemy and taken him alive, and he had counted coup in a way that would have made his ancestors proud. 2 more war deeds completed, 2 to go. But those last 2 deeds would have to wait until the very end of the war. In the final weeks of April 1945, the The war in Europe was rapidly approaching its conclusion. The German army was in full retreat. Hitler was in his bunker in Berlin. The end was near, and everyone could feel it. Medicine Crow's company was pursuing German forces toward the Danube River. As a scout, Medicine Crow ranged ahead of the main force, gathering intelligence, looking for enemy positions, searching for threats. One day, while scouting the roads near Ulm, Medicine Crow spotted movement in the distance. He raised his binoculars and saw German soldiers on horseback. This was unusual. By this stage of the war, the Germans had lost most of their horses to the Eastern Front. Seeing mounted troops this far west was rare. Curious, Medicine Crow followed them at a distance. The horseman led him to a stone farmhouse surrounded by fields, and in those fields, Medicine Crow saw approximately 50 horses grazing peacefully. His heart must have skipped a beat. 50 horses, an enemy encampment, and the fourth war deed suddenly within reach: steal an enemy's horse. Medicine Crow reported his finding to his captain. The captain ordered the farmhouse surrounded and planned an attack for the following dawn. The American forces moved into position under cover of darkness, preparing to strike at first light. But as the minutes ticked toward dawn, Medicine Crow approached his captain with a request. Could he have 5 minutes before the attack began? He did not want the horses hurt in the crossfire, and besides, there was something he needed to do. The captain, who by now understood that his Native American scout had his own way of doing things, agreed. In the pre-dawn darkness, Medicine Crow moved toward the farmhouse. The horses had been corralled for the night. Near the corral, German guards slept in a shed, exhausted from the long retreat. Medicine Crow crept past them, silent as smoke. He approached one of the horses, a fine-looking animal that stood calmly in the darkness. Medicine Crow had been riding horses since he was a child. He knew how to calm them, how to gentle them, how to make them trust him even in unfamiliar circumstances. He stroked the horse's neck, whispering to it in Crow. From his pocket, Medicine Crow pulled a short length of rope. With practiced hands, he tied it into a makeshift bridle, using the double half-hitch knot his grandfather had taught him decades ago. This was the same kind of bridle Crow warriors had used for centuries when stealing horses from enemy camps. The technique had not changed. Medicine Crow slipped the bridle over the horse's head. He checked the time. He had used 4 of his 5 minutes. It was now or never. He vaulted onto the horse's back, just as his ancestors had done countless times in the centuries before, and then he let out a crow war cry that shattered the silence of the German night. The other horses, startled by the sound, began to bolt. Medicine Crow opened the corral gate and turned his mount toward freedom. Behind him, the rest of the horses stampeded out of the corral in a thunder of hooves. German soldiers stumbled out of the shed, confused and half asleep, reaching for weapons that were not where they had left them. Medicine Crow rode at the head of the stampede, guiding the panicked horses away from the farmhouse. And as he rode, he began to sing. He sang a Crow honor song, a praise song for warriors returning victorious from battle. The same kind of song his grandfather had sung. The same kind of song Crow warriors had sung for 1,000 years. 5 minutes after Medicine Crow had left the American lines, the artillery bombardment began. The Germans at the farmhouse, now fully awake but thoroughly confused by the loss of their horses, had no time to mount an effective defense. By the time the sun fully rose, the farmhouse had surrendered. Medicine Crow returned to the American lines with 50 captured enemy horses. He was still singing the Crow honor song. His men, who had watched this entire spectacle unfold, were laughing and cheering. Their scout, the quiet man who wore war paint under his uniform, had just pulled off the most audacious horse theft any of them had ever seen. But more than that, Medicine Crow had completed the 4th war deed. He had stolen an enemy's horse, or rather, 50 of them. He had done it. Against all odds, in the midst of the most mechanized war in human history, Private Joseph Medicine Crow had completed all 4 war deeds required to become a war chief of the Crow Nation. He was 31 years old, and he had just become the last warrior to earn this honor in combat. The last war chief of the Crow tribe, the last Plains Indian war chief in history. When the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, Medicine Crow returned home to Montana. There was a ceremony waiting for him. The tribal elders had heard his reports. They had listened to his accounts of the 4 war deeds, and they were ready to grant him the honor he had earned. In a traditional ceremony, Joseph Medicine Crow was named a war chief. His grandfather's legacy was fulfilled. The old ways, it turned out, had not died. They had simply been waiting for the right warrior to carry them forward into a new age. But Medicine Crow was given a new name as well. He was no longer Winter Man. Now he was High Bird, soaring above the conflicts of the world, seeing everything from a higher perspective. It was a name that would carry him through the rest of his long and extraordinary life. Medicine Crow did not rest on his laurels. After the war, he returned to his studies and finally completed his doctorate work, though he never formally received the degree. But he did receive something better: honorary doctorates from Rocky Mountain College in 1999, the University of Southern California in 2003, and Bacone College in 2010. More importantly, he became the Crow tribal historian and anthropologist in 1948, a position he would hold for more than 50 years. He became what his people called the keeper of memories, the man who preserved the stories, the photographs, the oral histories of the Crow Nation. He was the last living person to have heard direct, first-hand testimony about the Battle of the Little Bighorn from people who were actually there. He had sat as a child and listened to White Man Runs Him describe what he saw that day in 1876. That made him a living bridge between the 19th century and the 21st, a connection to a world that had vanished. Medicine Crow wrote numerous books on Crow history and culture. He authored Crow Migration Story, From the Heart of Crow Country, Counting Coup, Becoming a Crow Chief on the Reservation and Beyond, and many others. He even wrote a children's book called Brave Wolf and the Thunderbird. He wrote the script for the Battle of the Little Bighorn reenactment that has been performed every summer in Hardin, Montana, since 1965. He was a founding member of Little Bighorn College. He was a founding member of the Buffalo Bill Historical Center in Cody, Wyoming. He lectured at universities across the country well into his 90s. He appeared in Ken Burns's documentary series The War in 2007, where he told his story to a national audience. Ken Burns later said, "The story of Joseph Medicine Crow is something I've wanted to tell for 20 years. His awards and honors accumulated over the decades. On June 25, 2008, he received 2 military decorations, the Bronze Star for his combat actions, and the French Légion d'honneur, one of France's highest honors. He also received the Combat Infantryman Badge, the Army Good Conduct Medal, the American Campaign Medal, the European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal." In 2008, Senators Max Baucus, John Tester, and Mike Enzi introduced a bill to award him the Congressional Gold Medal, though it did not receive the required sponsorship to move forward. But on August 12, 2009, something even more significant happened. President Barack Obama awarded Joseph Medicine Crow the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. During the ceremony at the White House, Obama leaned carefully away from Medicine Crow's magnificent feathered headdress as he placed the medal around the old warrior's neck. Then the president spoke, referring to Medicine Crow as Bachiche, which means a good man in the Crow language. Obama said, "Wearing war paint beneath his uniform and a sacred feather beneath his helmet, Joseph Medicine Crow completed the 4 battlefield deeds that made him the last Crow war chief." Dr. Medicine Crow's life reflects not only the warrior spirit of the Crow people, but America's highest ideals. In his final years, Joseph Medicine Crow continued to live on the Crow Reservation, near Lodge Grass, in the same area where he had been born more than a century earlier. His wife had passed away in 2009. His eyesight and hearing had faded, but his mind remained sharp, and he continued to tell the stories, to pass on the memories, to serve as that bridge between past and present. Herman Viola, Curator Emeritus at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American Indians, said of him, "I always told people, when you meet Joe Medicine Crow, you're shaking hands with the 19th century. He really wanted to walk in both worlds, the white world and the Indian world, and he knew education was a key to success." Medicine Crow did walk in both worlds. He was a warrior and a scholar. He was a tribal historian and a holder of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He was a man who could speak with equal authority about battlefield tactics in World War II and the meaning of counting coup on the Great Plains. He embodied the warrior spirit of his ancestors while embracing the tools and opportunities of the modern world. On April 3, 2016, Joseph Medicine Crow died at a hospice in Billings, Montana. He was 102 years old. He had lived through World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, Vietnam, the moon landing, the Internet age, and into the 21st century. He had been born when automobiles were still a novelty and lived to see smartphones and social media. Senator John Tester said, "Today Montana lost a treasure." Joe Medicine Crow was a soldier and a scholar, but above all, he was a fierce advocate for Native American families. The Secretary of the Interior issued a statement calling him a living legend who had shared direct oral testimony from his grandfather about the Battle of Little Big Horn to Native Americans and all who would listen. His renowned studies of First Americans and contributions to cultural and historical preservation have been critical to our understanding of America's history. Medicine Crow was survived by his son Ron Medicine Crow, his daughters Vernell Medicine Crow and Diane Reynolds, and his stepdaughter Garnet Watan. He was given full military honors at his funeral. In 2022, the University of Southern California officially named a historic campus building after him, the Dr. Joseph Medicine Crow Center for International and Public Affairs. The school also established a scholarship program for Native students in his name. A middle school in Billings, Montana, where he had spent his final days, was also named in his honor. The story of Joseph Medicine Crow is many things. It is a war story. It is a story about bridging cultures and walking in two worlds. It is a story about the power of tradition and the importance of education. It is a story about how the old ways can adapt to new circumstances without losing their essential meaning. But perhaps most of all, it is a story about what it means to be a warrior. When Medicine Crow wrote about warfare in his memoirs, he emphasized that Plains Indian warfare was not about killing. It was about intelligence, leadership, and honor. A true warrior did not simply destroy his enemies. He proved himself through acts that required courage, skill, and self-control. Counting coup, touching an enemy without killing him, required a warrior to get close enough to die and yet exercise restraint. Stealing horses required stealth and cunning. Taking an enemy's weapon required strength and combat skill. Leading a war party required tactical intelligence and the ability to bring everyone home alive. These were not the skills of a killer. They were the skills of a complete warrior, someone who could fight when necessary, but who valued life, honor, and leadership above simple violence. Medicine Crow proved that these ancient warrior values could still have meaning in the modern world. When he refused to shoot the German soldier in that alley, when he heard the man crying for his mother and chose mercy over murder, he was honoring those ancient values. When he led his men through the hell of the Siegfried line and brought every single one of them home alive, he was embodying the principle that a true leader protects his warriors. When he stole those horses and sang a Crow war song while riding away from the enemy, he was connecting the modern battlefield to the ancient traditions of his people. He showed that being a warrior is not about technology or weapons. It is about character. It is about courage tempered with wisdom. It is about strength tempered with mercy. It is about knowing when to fight and when to show restraint. And he showed that the old ways do not have to die. Simply because the world changes, they can adapt. They can find new expressions in new contexts. They can remain relevant across centuries and across cultures. Joseph Medicine Crow never killed a man in hand-to-hand combat. He never took pride in killing. Instead, he took pride in the fact that he had faced his enemies, proved his courage, and still chosen mercy when he could. That is the mark of a true warrior chief. His legacy lives on in the books he wrote, in the stories he preserved, in the students he inspired, in the awards and honors that bear his name. But his greatest legacy may be the example he set of how to honor your ancestors while embracing the future, How to be a warrior in a world that still needs warriors, but no longer fights the same old wars. He was the last of his kind, the last war chief of the Crow Nation, the last Plains Indian war chief. When he died at the age of 102, an entire era died with him. But the stories live on, the traditions live on, the memories he preserved live on. And somewhere on the plains of Montana, the wind still whispers the old songs, the songs of warriors and horse thieves and men who counted coup on their enemies and lived to tell the tale. Joseph Medicine Crow, High Bird, the last war chief, rode into the sunset in April of 2016. He completed his journey. He fulfilled his grandfather's command. He walked in two worlds and brought honor to both. And if the old ones are watching from wherever warriors go when their battles are done, they must have welcomed him home with the highest praise. Well done, War Chief. Well done. That's all for today's tales. Thanks for watching and see you next time.